They stamped it no grade. She wrote one word on the invoice. Inventory. 640 burlap sacks. Every tag tied with baling twine. Every tag marked in blue pencil like a warning nobody wanted to touch. The county man told her the fiber was contaminated enough to count as an environmental problem. Mara Halloway backed her flatbed against the loading bay anyway. Before the sun came up, before anyone in town had time to talk her out of it. Lewiston, Idaho. March of 1998. Clearwater Felt and Batting had been closed for 29 days. The windows were papered over. The steam pipes were cold. A plant that had turned mountain wool into mattress, Felt for almost half a century, had gone silent so fast that the break room still had coffee grounds drying in the machine. And out back, under a sagging metal awning, sat the part no buyer wanted. Sacks of belly wool, neck wool, second cuts. Coarse targy, clips full of chaff, grease, burrs, alkali dust, cheatgrass, and enough little broken seeds to make any commercial carding drum scream. The mill called it waste because its machines could not forgive it. That did not mean the fiber was useless. Mara knew there was a difference. She was 26 years old, narrow-shouldered, black hair usually twisted into a knot under a faded denim cap. Brown hands cracked at the knuckles from winter fence work. She had grown up on 90 acres outside Grangeville with one grandmother, a flock of range ewes, and a barn roof that leaked in 3 different places depending on the wind. Her grandmother, June Halloway, had died in November. Left Mara the flock, the well pump, 2 worn Ashford wheels, a cedar chest full of notebooks, and a ranch that owed more than it had made in 4 years. At the Grangeville Co-op, the wool buyer had offered 38 cents a pound for clean clip. 38 cents. Less than the price of the paper bag he handed the receipt in. So when Mara heard 2 truckers at the cafe joking about the mountain of rejected fiber the Lewiston mill was paying to dump, she did not hear a joke. She heard a balance sheet with a door left open. The receiver at the mill was a pale man named Don, with red eyes and a desk full of shut-down paperwork. He had a landfill contract waiting beside his phone. $42 per sack to haul it out. 640 sacks. $26,880 just to make the problem disappear. Mara stood in the office with her hands in the pockets of a torn canvas coat and made the offer. She would take all of it, no fee, no claim, no return, just sign the release. Don looked past her through the grimy office window, at the flatbed she had borrowed from her cousin. Then he laughed once, like the room had slipped sideways, not cruelly, just confused. The laugh people use when they do not yet realize they are standing beside a decision that will outlive them. He signed. By 6:10, Mara was on the dock with a hay hook and a 2-wheel dolly, dragging the first sack across stained concrete. Each sack weighed close to 90 pounds. Greasy wool does not lift clean. It shifts, it sags, it remembers every animal it came from. By the 4th sack, her coat was streaked with lanolin. By the 11th, her palms were hot under the gloves. That was when Warren Pike arrived. Warren was the county agricultural compliance officer, though he said the title like it came with weather of its own. Tall, tidy, gray-blonde hair cut close above his ears, pressed brown slacks, new boots with no crease at the ankle. He carried a clipboard under one arm. Not because he needed it, because it made his concern look official. He stood at the edge of the loading bay and watched Mara fight a sack up the ramp. Then he said, "Calm as a church bell, Mara. That volume of raw grease wool may trigger storage and runoff restrictions. You have animal grease, vegetable matter, biological contamination, potential washwater issues. Your grandmother's place is not built for industrial handling." He looked at the sacks, then back at her. "This is a little deep for you. A little deep." Mara did not answer. She hooked the next sack, leaned her weight into it, and dragged it toward the truck. Warren wrote something on his clipboard. That was the first official record of what he thought she could not do. It took her 7 days to move the fiber. 7 days of dawn trips down Highway 95 and long climbs back into the hills with the flatbed stacked high enough that the ropes thrummed in the cold wind. She stacked the sacks in the old sheep barn, under tarps, along the north wall, against the grain bins, anywhere she could keep them off wet ground. On the 5th day, Bev Calder stopped by. Bev ran cattle on the next ridge. Big hands, silver braid, mud on her boots so permanent it looked like part of the leather. She stood in the barn doorway with a thermos tucked under one arm and stared at the wall of sacks. "What exactly did you buy?" Mara cut one sack open with a short bone-handled knife and pulled out a fistful of wool. It was yellow with grease, stuck with burrs, harsh at the tips, springy at the base. She held it up to the gray window light. "I did not buy it," she said. "Then what is it?" Mara pulled the lock apart between her fingers, a question the mill did not know how to price. Bev snorted. That sounded like June that night. Mara sat at the kitchen table with the cedar chest open beside her. The house was cold except for the stovepipe heat that climbed through the wall. June's notebooks were not pretty, no pressed flowers, no sentimental pages. Just blocky handwriting, ratios, failed dye baths, grazing notes, wash temperatures, crop rotations, and strange little sentences that landed harder because the old woman never wasted words. On the inside cover of the first notebook, Mara found the line June had written in pencil in 1976. "A coal pile is not the end of a thing. It is where the listening starts." Mara read it 3 times. Then she started sorting. Here is what the mill saw when it looked at that wool. Too coarse for fashion yarn, too short for industrial combing, too much burr, too much grease, too inconsistent. Every category was a reason to reject it. But fiber is not a moral question. It does not become bad because a buyer needs it to be uniform. A fine apparel fleece might run 20 microns. Mara's sacks were closer to 31, 34, sometimes 38. That meant it did not want to become soft baby yarn. It wanted to become something with backbone. Weaving yarn, rug yarn, outerwear yarn, saddle blanket yarn, the kind of yarn that does not apologize for being built like rope. June had written that years earlier in her notebook. "Do not ask coarse wool to be silk. Ask it to survive." Mara sorted by hand. Longer staple into one feed sack, shorter locks into another, burr-heavy fiber into a third pile for felting. The worst of the chaff went into burlap-marked compost because even the unusable part still had a job. For 3 days, all she did was pull, shake, grade, and breathe through the smell of dust and lanolin. By the end, the ridges of her fingerprints had vanished under waxy grease. Then came scouring. That was where the first real mistake found her. June's old wash system was drawn across 4 pages. 2 troughs made from cut-down water tanks. 1 rinse barrel, a barrel stove, a thermometer clipped to a strip of copper. Soda ash measured by weight, not by mood. Mara built it behind the barn because the kitchen could not take the smell. The first morning, steam rolled low across the frozen ground. The wood stove popped. The water looked harmless. She was tired and impatient. She loaded too much wool into the first tank. She let the water climb to 152 degrees. Then she stirred it because she thought stirring meant cleaning. 20 minutes later, she lifted out a single gray slab. Not locks, not fiber. A felted sheet so dense she could have cut boot soles from it. A full batch gone. 1 wrong number, 1 wrong motion. 90 pounds turned into a lesson she could not sell. That night she found June's note on scouring. Never bully wool in hot water. Heat wakes it up. Agitation makes it lock arms. Under that, in darker pencil, keep the wash below 130. Move water around the fiber. Do not move fiber around the water. Mara sat with that line until the stove burned low. Next morning she started again. 124 degrees, 127, never above 130. She used a laundry basket as a cradle so the water could move through the wool without her churning it. Soda ash loosened the grease. Rainwater carried out the dirt. Yellow lanolin rose to the top in soft islands. When the clean wool came out loose and springy, she held it between both hands and laughed once. Not because it was easy, because it had finally answered. Carding was slower. The old hand cards had been June's, maple paddles, wire teeth, handles worn dark from decades of palms. Mara pulled the fiber across them until the locks lined up into soft rolls. 10 minutes, 20, 40. Her shoulders burned. At 2 pounds an hour, 640 sacks looked less like inventory and more like punishment. Then she found the drum carter in the machine shed under a canvas tarp, its crank bent, the cloth teeth dull but intact. She spent half a day oiling it. The first bat came off uneven and full of neps. The second was worse. The third was usable. By sundown, she had a stack of cream-colored bats on the workbench and a headache from leaning over the crank. Spinning came next. And spinning was where the wool stopped being obedient. The first yarn broke every 18 inches. Too much twist, then not enough. Too tight, then drifting apart. Mara swore at the wheel until her throat hurt. Then she found a line in June's notebook, folded between 2 dye recipes. The draft is not pulled from the hands. It is negotiated between the hands. Mara slowed down. She let the twist travel. She stopped trying to force a smooth commercial yarn out of a fiber that had already told her what it was. By midnight, she had one ugly skein, lumpy, strong, alive. She hung it on a nail above the workbench. It weighed 4 ounces. It had taken almost 9 hours. The scale could weigh the skein. It could not weigh what she had learned making it. For 6 weeks, Mara worked the rhythm into her body. Scour in the morning, pick and card after lunch, spin until her ankle ached from the treadle. Wind skeins at the kitchen table with June's notebook open beside the coffee cup. The barn took on a new smell. Wet wool, wood smoke, soda ash, thawing earth. Then Warren Pike came back. This time he had a folded packet. 3 pages. Graywater storage inquiry. Potential runoff citation. Possible daily penalty. He stood beside the scouring tanks while steam lifted off the water and said, almost gently, "I know you mean well, Mara. But meaning well does not make a processing system legal." He pointed toward the lower pasture where the washwater ran in a shallow ditch. "You are downhill from a seasonal draw. If this reaches the creek, the county can fine you per incident." Then he paused. Same small lift of the chin. "You are trying to run a mill on a sheep place." That was the kind of sentence that sounds factual until you hear the contempt inside it. Mara took the packet. "Read the first page. Folded it once. Do you need a response date?" Warren blinked. 30 days, she nodded. Then she went back to lifting the basket from the wash tank. 4 words would have been easier. Go to hell. But June had raised her better than that. She gave him a deadline and let the work answer. That night, she opened the 3rd notebook. Near the back, between a pasture map and a page on lambing losses, she found a sketch titled Soap Water Bed. Not sewage, not waste pit. Bed, a trench, gravel, sand, charcoal, willow slips and rushes planted on the far end. June had written, "Lanolin is only trouble when it has nowhere to go." Mara built it in 12 days. Not because it was simple, because she had 30. She dug the trench with a mattock until the heel of her right hand split open. She hauled gravel from the dry wash in feed buckets. She burned brush for charcoal and crushed it in a metal trough. She cut willow slips from the creek edge and planted them in the gray water bed like fence posts. The first week, the bed smelled sour. The second week, the rushes stood up. By the 4th week, the outflow ran clear enough that Mara took a mason jar of it to the county lab herself. The report came back within limits. She mailed Warren Pike a copy. No letter, no note, just the lab sheet folded around a dried willow leaf. After that, she started dyeing. June had never bought color if she could grow it. pull it, scrape it, soak it, or boil it out of something most people walked past. Rabbit brush for yellow, black walnut hulls for brown, madder in a broken row along the south fence, dock root for gold, iron water for gray-green. Indigo cakes wrapped in waxed paper at the bottom of the cedar chest, old but still alive enough to work. The first madder bath nearly failed because Mara overheated it. The color went dull, rusty, too brown at the edges. She read the notebook again. Do not cook the red out of the root. So she kept the pot below 180 degrees. Let the chopped roots release slowly. Mordanted the wool with alum at 8% weight of fiber. When she lifted the first skein, the color came out deep clay red. Darker where the twist held tight, lighter where the yarn opened. No factory would call that consistent. A weaver would call it breathing. She did rabbit brush next. A sharp, dry yellow like late summer hills. Then black walnut hulls, rich brown with a green undertone. Then indigo over rabbit brush, a dusty range green that looked like sage after rain. By May, 26 skeins hung from dowels in the barn loft. Red, brown, sage, cream, gold. Every tag listed the sack number, dye plant, mordant, and date. Any skein could be traced back to the exact sack the mill had declared worthless. Bev Calder came back on a wet afternoon and stopped under the loft ladder. She was halfway through unscrewing her thermos when she saw the colors. For once, Bev did not speak first. She climbed 3 rungs, touched the red skein with 2 fingers, and looked at Mara differently than she had on the day of the sacks. How much? Mara wiped her hands on her jeans. For what? For this. Mara had not priced it. That sounds strange now, but it was true. She had spent every hour thinking like a processor, not a merchant. Bev looked at the row of skeins. My daughter weaves. She would fight a woman for that green. That night, Mara sat at the kitchen table and did the math. Raw fiber, free, hauling fuel, $46 so far. Soda ash, propane, alum, tags, twine, postage. Enough to make each 4-ounce skein cost her about 40 cents before labor. Labor was the problem. A skein carried almost 4 hours of work when she counted everything honestly. Sorting, scouring, drying, picking, carding, spinning, plying, dyeing, rinsing, drying again, winding, tagging. No machine had done the patient part for her. She searched handspun rug yarn listings on a computer that made noise every time it loaded a page. $22, $28, $36, some sold higher. She took a calculator and ran the number 3 times. A 4-ounce skein at $30 meant $120 per finished pound. The mill had paid to get rid of the raw wool. The buyer had called it a liability. Mara stared at the calculator. The scale had weighed the wrong thing. It had weighed fiber. It had not weighed attention. She listed 18 skeins online under the name Halloway Range Fiber. No logo, no brand story polished by anyone in town. Just photographs of the yarn on June's scarred workbench beside the hand cards, the bone-handled knife, and a chipped enamel cup full of rabbit brush stems. She wrote the listing plainly. Rejected mill wool. Hand scoured on a sheep ranch in Idaho, spun slowly, dyed with plants grown or gathered on the place. 18 skeins, $30 each. Then she closed the computer because she did not want to watch nothing happen. At 5:41 the next morning, she woke before the alarm. She made coffee, opened the computer, and sat down before she understood why her knees had weakened. Sold out, all 18. $540 while she slept. There were messages, not 1, not 2, 17. A woman in Spokane wanted 6 more skeins in sage. A weaver in Missoula asked whether the brown could be made heavier for rug warp. A shop owner in Boise wanted to know if Mara had wholesale terms. The last message came from a textile designer in Portland who made small-run blankets for a catalog. She wanted 120 skeins by fall, madder red, walnut brown, and the sage green. 120. Mara got up from the table and walked to the barn. The sheep were pressing along the fence line, waiting for feed. The roof dripped where the patch had failed again. 600 sacks of rejected fiber sat in rows like a dare. She did the math standing there because numbers behave differently when you are looking at the work. Her ranch needed $2,100 a month to stay upright. Feed, taxes, insurance, fuel, well repairs. At $30 per skein, 70 skeins a month could hold the place. If she worked 6 days and stopped pretending sleep was optional, she could make 90, maybe 100, not forever, but enough to survive the next season. She went back inside and answered every message herself. No promises she could not keep, no rush discount, no apology for the slowness. To the Portland designer, she wrote 4 sentences. I can supply 12 skeins a week. The colors will vary by batch because the plants vary by season. I will not bleach, standardize, or synthetic dye the yarn to force sameness. If that works for your line, I can start in June. The reply came back in less than an hour. That is exactly why I want it. That was the first time the market paid her for refusing to make the wool pretend. Summer changed the ranch, not all at once, not like a miracle, like irrigation water finding the low places. Fiber forums shared photographs. Weavers posted close-ups of the handspun texture. Customers talked about the color shifts as if they were flaws until other customers corrected them. That is not inconsistency. That is batch truth. The phrase spread. Batch truth. Mara did not invent it. A weaver in Oregon did. But it belonged to the work, so she kept it. By August, she had a wait list of 83 names. By October, 212. By winter, she had paid the back taxes that had sat unopened in the kitchen drawer. Warren Pike came again in November. He parked farther from the barn this time. His boots got muddy before he reached the tanks. The clipboard was still there, but he did not hold it like a shield. The county had received questions from 3 small operators about legal washwater handling, he said. Then he looked toward the willow bed. Would you be willing to explain how this system works? Mara went inside and came back with a photocopy of June's sketch and the lab report stapled to the back. She handed both to him. He looked at the name at the bottom. June Halloway. Your grandmother designed this, Mara said. She listened earlier than the rest of us. Warren folded the pages carefully and put them in his coat pocket. He did not apologize. Men like Warren often cannot find that tool when they need it. But he took the drawing, and the next spring, the county extension newsletter printed a 1-page note about low-volume wool washwater filtration using gravel, charcoal, willow uptake, and lab-tested outflow. They did not say Mara had been right. They did not say Warren had been wrong. Official paper rarely has that kind of courage. But it changed the rules in the direction of the woman they had warned. That was enough. The neighbors came slower than the customers. Ranch people do not pivot because a magazine says something is interesting. They wait to see whether it lasts through winter. Bev was first. She brought 3 sacks of coarse clip from the back of her stock trailer, material her buyer had marked down to nearly nothing. Mara graded it, weighed it, and paid her 60 cents a pound. Bev looked at the check. Commodity was $39. I know. You paying charity? No. Mara pointed at the sacks. I am paying for what I can hear in it. Bev stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and said, June would have enjoyed watching people learn late. Within a year, 4 ranches were bringing Mara the parts their wool buyers discounted. Within 3 years, Halloway Range Fiber had a standing order list, a rebuilt drying loft, and 1 part-time helper who knew how to scour without felting a batch. By 2004, the dye rows had become a 1/4 acre. Rabbit brush transplanted along the fence, madder under the south slope, weld near the garden shed. Indigo under low tunnels because the Camas prairie nights stayed cold too long. The graywater bed fed the willows, and the willow cuttings shaded the dye plants, and the dye plants colored the wool, and the wool paid the taxes that kept the land under her feet. Nothing was a straight line. That was the secret. The whole system looped. In 2006, a craft magazine sent a photographer. Mara hated the idea until the woman spent the first hour photographing hands instead of faces. Hands pulling burrs. Hands lifting wet skeins. Hands writing batch tags. Hands turning the drum carder. The article ran under a title Mara did not choose. The woman who refused to throw wool away. Orders doubled, then tripled. Mara capped them anyway. She did not want a factory. She had already seen what factories do to things that do not fit. 19 years after the morning at the loading bay, the barn looked different from the outside. New metal roof, solar panels on the machine shed, a better door on the north wall. But inside, the logic had not changed. It was 2017, and Mara was 45. The black hair under the denim cap had silver at the temples now. Her hands were thicker at the knuckles. The bone-handled knife still lived in her right pocket. June's notebook still stayed on the shelf above the workbench, wrapped in a tea towel when the barn got damp. Halloway Range Fiber processed wool from 9 neighboring ranches. 9. Every one of them had once sold coarse fiber as a problem. Now Mara paid above commodity for the very clips buyers used to reject. 4 women worked part-time in the barn. Bev Calder's daughter managed the dye garden 2 days a week. A retired school teacher handled tags and shipping because she had handwriting customers started recognizing on site. Annual revenue crossed $162,000 the year. Mara finally replaced the cracked kitchen window. The wait list stayed 5 months deep. Not because Mara could not make more money by expanding. Because she could. That was the danger. She had refused 3 loans for equipment that would have tripled output and flattened the yarn into something else. The bankers called it inefficiency. Mara called it the part people were paying for. The mature system was not romantic, it was work. Greasy fleeces arrived in labeled sacks. Each lot was opened, skirted, graded, and recorded. Wash water stayed under 130 degrees. The willow bed was sampled twice a year. Mordant recipes were logged by weight of fiber. Dye plants were harvested by season, not convenience. No synthetic dyes. No bleach, no false sameness. Every skein left the barn with a tag that told the truth. Ranch, fiber type, dye source, mordant, batch, date. If a customer asked why 2 red skeins did not match exactly, Mara did not apologize. She explained the rain. A dry year makes the root concentrate differently. An early frost changes the leaf. A sheep that grazes sagebrush all summer gives a different handle than one wintered near the barn. The world leaves fingerprints. The yarn keeps them. Warren Pike retired in 2012. Before he left, he filed a regional extension memo recommending small-scale grease wool processors study the Halloway Willowbed model for low-volume wash water management. Mara did not learn that from Warren. She learned it from Bev, who heard it from the county secretary's husband at a feed store counter. That seemed about right. Warren never came to the barn to say he had misread her. But somewhere in a county archive, his signature sits under a paragraph proving he had. Mara never needed more than that. By then, the larger change had already escaped her fence line. Bev's ranch had its own line of heavy blanket yarn. 2 sisters outside Cottonwood started growing madder and weld for local fiber artists. A young couple near Kamaya built their own washwater bed from June's sketch. The co-op that once treated coarse wool like a nuisance began holding it aside in marked bins because people asked for it by name. Coal wool, range wool, strong wool. Words matter. A material changes in the market when people stop naming it after the failure of a machine. Then came Tessa, 23 years old, agriculture degree from the University of Idaho. Boots too clean, notebook too new, eyes moving around the barn like she was trying to memorize the room before she had earned it. Mara recognized the nervousness immediately. It was the look of someone standing in front of work big enough to expose them. She showed Tessa the scouring tanks first, then the carder, then the spinning wheels, then the loft where skeins hung from dowels in long rows of clay red, walnut brown, rabbit brush yellow, sage green, storm gray, cream. The air held lanolin, dried plants, wood dust, and wet earth. Tessa reached for a red skein, then stopped herself. Mara said, "Go ahead." Tessa touched it. "It is rougher than I expected." "Good," Mara said. "Softness is not the only virtue." At the workbench, Mara opened June's first notebook and turned it so the younger woman could read the pencil line on the inside cover. A coal pile is not the end of a thing. It is where the listening starts. Tessa read it silently. Then she looked toward the sacks waiting by the door. "What do you want me to do first?" Mara handed her a hay hook. "Start by finding out what is actually in the bag." That afternoon, Mara stood outside the barn while Tessa dragged her first sack across the floor. Beyond the fence, the dye rows were just beginning to green. The willows at the washwater bed had thickened into a living wall. The sheep were spread across the pasture with their heads down, turning grass into next year's fiber without knowing anyone had ever called last year's worthless. The old mill in Lewiston had been torn down. The loading bay was gone. The landfill never got those sacks, and the scale that once said the wool was worth less than the cost of hauling it away had never been fixed. Not really. It could weigh pounds. It could weigh grease. It could weigh uniformity. But it still could not weigh listening. Mara closed June's notebook, laid the bone-handled knife beside it on the workbench, and walked back into the barn where the rejected wool was waiting to become what the machines had never been patient enough to see.